But what the purposes of this podcast, we wanted to lay the foundation of that intersection between wellness and body image. The biggest part of the intersection here at Fitness Protection is we're trying to encourage healthy habits. There is nobody that is incapable or unworthy of love. I'll just jump right in about a story, and this is one of my favorite stories to tell. 1994, I am an exchange student in Russia, and we're in Rostov-na-Donu. And the fun part about 1994 Russia, for at least when you're 13 and you don't know any better, was buying cassette tapes and being able to buy them cheaply. Every time we stopped, every time we got on the metro, anywhere you went, there were people selling things. And the most prized item to a stupid 13-year-old in 1994 were the cassettes and the records and the discs that I was not allowed to purchase or consume at home. So it was like a month of freedom in Russia. Absorb that. There was one tape in particular. I remember purchasing it, and this tape to this day lives in a safety deposit box because that's how good the story is. Wow. When we got back on the boat, because everything was just like poor translations and it was all handwritten, or a bad, if you were really lucky, like a high-end bootleg was a bad color photocopy of the album that you just bought. Otherwise, it was white with old school daisy wheel printer on the front with a badly translated name. So there was one I remember this one that I purchased, the cassette tape in question. It had Ana Vernulas written on the front. And the literal translation, pabukvam is how you say it in Russia, word for word, pabukvam is she returned. And we were all like, what song is that? Because we would just scoop these up and walk out and not even have any idea what we just purchased a lot of the time. And it was fun to hit it put it in the tape deck and hit play and see what yeah. And what came out of this one in particular was Baby Got Back. Which is amazing to think about, right? But she returned, Baby Got Back, that. And when we put it in the tape deck and heard the dun 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 dun, there was that very familiar opening. Oh my God, Becky, look at her butt! You just knew. We all started laughing, and the translator on board got really angry. I don't know why you think this is funny. We're like, well, because it's incorrect. No, it isn't. It's right. It is correct. And we went back and forth about it because, yes, she returned is correct, but devoid of context, it does not express the sentiment of Baby Got Back. It's totally separate. And this, so the part of the fun part of the story for people that are not language majors and linguistic nerds is, of how, she returned was actually Baby Got Back. But for me, the real the real draw of that story is what happened right afterwards with the huge fight that happened with the translator and all of us. This is our language. This is our first language. I'm telling you, this is wrong. And he's like, nope, doubling down. So, bad translations are usually accurate because words, right? But inaccurate because those words lack context or don't convey the intended meaning. Not everything can be translated pabukvam word for word. And, I don't think this is why so many different translations exist of things like the Bible or even
Dante
works of Shakespeare where our language has changed over time. Would you say Dante?
Dante's Divine Comedy. Yeah. In fact, the translation that I actually think is one of the more interesting translations, and I end up recommending it to people a lot, even though it sounds terrible in English, is Longfellow's translation of the Divine Comedy. And the reason is that Longfellow doesn't speak Italian real good, so he pretty much just took a dictionary and he went in and did what was that word in Russian that means word for word?
Pabukvam. By the letter. Pabukvam. Mm-hmm.
I love that. I'm gonna try. Okay, pabukvam. So that describes, I would say, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's translation of the Divine Comedy. And what a lot of other translations do is they try and take take the literal meaning of things, but then make it sound really nice in English. They make it sound like a nice poem in English the way it's a nice poem in Italian. It's a lot more than a nice poem in Italian. But Longfellow doesn't even know how to do that. At least that is my understanding of the translation. So it actually preserves a lot of the word order from the original, but in a way that makes no sense in English. So it's very instructive to look at. You can learn a lot from looking at it, but one thing you're going to have a real hard time with is figuring out what the poem actually means.
Oh, for sure. I could speak for hours about like this, the main, if you look at all of the complaints and all of the criticism of Chernobyl, the HBO series, the docudrama, that for somehow is like the number one thing on TV ever. I'm like, how is this bigger than The Sopranos? I don't understand, but it's wonderful. I mean, I thought my husband and I like just absolutely loved it. We watched it 2 or 3 times all the way through. But the setting, the scenery, everything about it, the look, the feel, the sound, like from the second that I heard that toilet flushing, I was like, what in the very beginning? And you would have overlooked it, but the Soviet toilets were very specific and like they just don't really exist anymore, because the first thing people could do when they had a little money was like do a Zapadny Remont, first in the bathroom, a Western style renovation, first in the bathroom, then in the kitchen. But anyway, like when you hear that distinctive sort like Soviet style toilet flushing, which was all we heard in the countryside in 1994, I was just like, they had my undivided attention. But the biggest complaint I'm hearing from people is that the conversations would have never happened. No one would have ever spoken to party superiors the way that these defiant scientists did. You would never look a superior in the face and say, I am a nuclear physicist and you were working in a shoe factory before we got here, even if it's true. And I would be like, that doesn't take away from it. It makes it more accessible to someone who does not understand the workings of Soviet Russia. So maybe it's not pabukvam, but it conveys all the context in a way that isn't boring and doesn't make it feel like you got a narrator stepping in to explain what's really going on in the scene. So that's it. So it's tricky. It's like, how much accuracy do you really want? The conversation itself would have been very boring and would have required a lot of reading between the lines. This is do we have a problem? We do not have a problem, but there's kind of a problem without ever using the word problem. But is accurate better if it isn't more clear. So this became really important. I didn't realize how important this would become 2 years later when I would attend Georgetown, and realize how words and phrases that I had always held dear were just taken for granted, were completely not understood. I would say one thing and people would hear another, and somewhere in my head, I'm saying Anavernulis and Baby Got Back is playing in your head, and I don't know how to correct it. So there was always the biggest cross-cultural misunderstandings that I've had have been in English with other native English speakers. You know why when I started going by MK?
I want to hear you tell me again, because I don't remember. I want to say it was abroad somewhere.
Yeah, when I was 22 years old, I was working in Tokyo, and we had a new guy who'd been living in Tokyo for 20 plus years. Older gentleman. By older, I mean older to 22-year-old me. He was probably in his mid-50s, and he just could not wrap his brain around Mary Catherine. He would just be like, Mary. I'm like, MK, motherfucker, come on. It's not that hard. So with that frustration, like, and that's not the easiest thing for a native Japanese speaker to wrap their brain around or their tongue around, but they all did it. It was the white dude who couldn't, and the white American is the reason I had to be MK, and it just kind of stuck. But these sorts of things, like, when like what people who were not raised around evangelical Christianity, what they think that actually is, it's so different. And just like I learned what not to say because of where those perceptions would be, and how to navigate spaces where people didn't know what words meant and care, because I was on their territory now. And so all of that kind of sounds like obtuse, but it really, I think that this story and this context provides the backdrop to discuss 2 hot button concepts that have been reduced to trigger words that our brains tend to shut down when we hear them. The first of which is wellness, and the other is body image. The two are intertwined and intersect in ways that matter a lot.
And seriously, like that, I feel like you see an Instagram thing about wellness, and my brain really wants to shut down every time the word wellness comes up. It really, especially because it has this aesthetic that it's always kind of infused with, and that aesthetic has come to mean so many things that I'm like, wait, I'm not really sure what you mean when you say this word. All I know is that you could mean a lot of things that I think you're using to sell me something, and I'm really suspicious automatically.
Oh yeah. Anything that claims to have like the answer or the secret, this thing you've been doing wrong and you never would have guessed, like the top 4 healing foods you've never tried. And I get it. That's clickbaity. People want the secret. People want to know. And I hope that we're kind of evolving past that stage in the information age where we're now in such overload. It's like, I want what someone's going to reduce to bullet points. But I'm hoping we're up on the other side of that now, but I don't know that we'll ever totally get there. But before we go any further, all of the reference material that we're going to talk about during the course of this podcast can and will be found in the show notes once we finish. I've been wanting to breathe fire pretty much every day since I got out of bed. And to be honest, longer than that. Ever since pain in my SI joint, my sacroiliac joint, during my 4th pregnancy rendered me bedbound. And what I would say and what I would mean was, once again, not what people would hear. And I haven't had to learn to navigate that space pretty much since Georgetown. And now I'm just pissed and I'm finished. And I really want to be open and start a bigger discussion about what we're talking about what are we really talking about when we talk about prevention? What are we preventing? When we talk about wellness, when we talk about, the perils and pitfalls and why, like concern trolling, and how wellness and body image and prevention all really kind of go together in ways that we might need to unspool. Mm-hmm. So, you ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah.
Born ready.
Let's start with wellness. So to give you a broad, high-level definition of wellness, it's anything a person does in order to stay well or not become sick. And today it's an industry that's growing at a CAGR of 6.5%. And that's an annualized growth rate. That's a banker term. And that's big. That's one of the most rapidly growing industries in the world. And that industry emerged in the typical capitalistic fashion. There was a hole in the market. Consumers rushed to fill it. Companies estimated the gap. And now they're pouncing. None of these ideas are new. They've been around. Like maybe you hadn't heard of a jade egg until Gwyneth Paltrow decided to put one in her vagina and sell it on Goop for $650. But again, that concept in and of itself about jade having magical properties is not new by a long shot. Mm-hmm. So for me, like that's a little... I can't quite get there. But as someone who lived in China, I can talk about jade's important. So my relationship with the word wellness, and I get a little protective of it, kind of like I do get protective when people talk about red states, which, I'm from one. My family still lives there. And I get really protective of them when people start painting a broad brush. Like if you want my brain to turn off, use the phrase flyover country. It means you haven't gone and you have no intention to, so you don't need to be talking about it. I can tell you because I've been there. I've lived there for 17 years. But I digress. The word wellness now tends to shut people down, but my foray into it was when I was diagnosed with celiac in 2006. It was at the long end of exhausting the medical opportunities available to me. Before I had left my little hometown in a red state most people will never see, my grandfather had really beaten it into my head. Like, you be careful out there. People are going to assume you're stupid. They're always going to hear your accent. They're going to see how much of a people pleaser you are, and they're going to use that against you. You ask for science every step of the way. I'm like, okay, you make them prove it, Mary Catherine, you promised me. I'm like, okay, I will always make people prove it. You got it. Which has made me a difficult woman. but I'm good with that. So when I would almost become contentious with my doctors, I would say, something is wrong. Something is really wrong. They're like, oh, we can't medically find anything wrong. It must be depression. It's IBS. It's leaky gut. It's chronic fatigue. This 2006, we were only just starting to really research and explore all of the spectrum of autoimmune disorders. Mm-hmm. And at that time, a celiac diagnosis was incredibly rare. And in the blog, I'll spare that story here. In the blog, I tell the story of how I finally got my diagnosis, and this kind of set in. It was through a healer, a former medical doctor who had left to practice Chinese medicine. And from there, jumping into wellness was hard. The book that he recommended that I read was called, I was by Dr. Julian McKeith. I'll think of it, the title will be in the show notes, but it's basically how to heal your body with food. And I was very not accepting of this because it wasn't science. And if you Googled her name at the time, it would have been like, she is a hoax and she has no idea what she was talking about. This isn't science. And it made me really nervous, but no one else was offering anything that worked. And this pathway really, really did. So there was a part of my brain that had to open, and that part had to open a lot more carefully when, she talks about fleshing out toxins, and then you have medical science saying, toxins, what is that? We don't know. We can't define it. It's not real. Don't worry about toxins. Well, then I get pregnant and I'm being told that I can't get a massage because toxins. And I'm like, but that's the stuff you guys said I didn't have to worry about before I got pregnant. But now that I am, toxins are a thing. Can you tell me what that is? And no one really can. So standing at that crossroads again, here comes wellness. We don't know what it is, but here's how you avoid them, or how you don't make yourself sick with toxins. Right. So I felt like that was a garbage word for the longest time. And then I parent an autistic child, and we wanted science. We went ABA. We did everything that was recommended except for one thing that we put off till the very end. And it was the one thing that transformed him. My lifelong regret will be not jumping on the occupational therapy bandwagon sooner, because all anyone could talk about was ABA, science. And I'm like, I wasn't ready to go down the skin brushing hole, because that is such a slippery slope. Mm-hmm. And you've seen parents and the companies that prey on them out of effectively desperation. And it's easy to shame the parent of a severely autistic child. It's a whole lot harder to help them, or be like, it's not that I don't like my child. I need them to stop punching me in the face when they're angry or triggered or scared. I am scared, and my kid is going to be bigger than me very soon. And this is not all autism. Don't come at me with that. We are very fortunate to be kind of where we are on the spectrum, but it's a spectrum for a reason. And there's a part that's not pretty, and we don't really want to support, and because we don't really know what to do with it. On the whole, how to treat it, how to prevent it, how to manage it, how to live with it. So on to that end, that's where all of the others, the skin brushing and the resetting the vestibular system, and we need to work on proprioception. All of that really kind of comes into play. Like, we're going to start at the very top, but because we can't be standardized in a laboratory setting, it's almost impossible to say, well, this kid needs 5 minutes on the Bosu ball, and then 5 minutes of wheelbarrows, and then because you can't. Right. There's no way to standardize a dosage of therapy, so it tends to be brushed aside. Or it's because if you don't know how to evaluate it, you'll be like, I'll come back to that later when I've exhausted the other things. But it transformed my kids so quickly after 2 years. Like, there will always be a part of me that didn't jump in there sooner. But the reason I didn't was because it wasn't scientifically backed. Yeah. It was wellness. And how do you look someone in the face and say, brushing your kid's skin is going to change your life, but you have to do it in exactly this manner, in exactly these 90-minute intervals, and it's going to take exactly this long. And there's all this exactness with no science that we're going to have to upend your entire family's life for 4 months while you do this. And if we get 3 weeks in and you stop, we're going to have to start the whole thing over again. It's just a lot when you can't back it up with the traditional, and what works for one might not work for everyone else. So because wellness, it can encompass the white girl wellness, which is how Taffy in the New York Times article. And there's an amazing podcast episode by Still Processing called We Got Gooped. and it's definitely worth listening to. It's fantastic. That link is in the show notes as well. And that's on the back of a New York Times article written by Taffy, last name I can't remember. Doesn't matter. It's in the show notes. And she talks about how her journey into kind of wellness starts with what is known as the white wealthy woman wellness that is promoted by Goop, but trickles all the way down to practices like, we don't know what else to do, so we're going to put you next to a great big piece of jade and pray for its healing properties that was practiced in China like 5,000 years ago.
I mean, and there's something though, isn't there, about that exactness precisely that gives a little bit, it's something to grab onto, right? You talk about this a lot. You talk about the work, give me the work and give me the work and I will do it. And you know what, if I do it right and I do it exactly the way, maybe something great will happen. Great things might come out of this. They won't if I don't do it, but if I do it, they might. And, so I feel like my own experience of wellness, which has actually been much more through other people than through myself. I hear a lot of things that remind me of the time when my mom went down a super wellness rabbit hole that was basically the rest of her life after her first cancer diagnosis, actually after her second cancer diagnosis. So I've talked about how my mom died of breast cancer in the year 2000. She was actually diagnosed in 1993 when I was 6 years old. And so for the first time, it was like, all right, we're going to go to Mass General Hospital. They're going to do the best things. And it's going to, we're going to throw everything at the wall the way you do with cancer. And I think that the protocol for a first cancer diagnosis is probably very different now than it was then. For her, it was a single mastectomy and then lots of chemotherapy and radiation. And, hopefully everything is okay after that and you don't have a recurrence. And the chemotherapy was really awful. It was really, really, really awful. There was a time when I remember this really distinctly, she finally got to come home and it felt like she'd been in the hospital for a super long time. She got to come home and they had said, well, you just need to monitor her temperature. And I was 6, 7 years old. And I was like, well, let's take mommy's temperature. And so we took her temperature and her temperature was like well over 100. And so she had to go back to the hospital. And I was the one who insisted that we take her temperature. And I thought that it was my fault that she had to go back to the hospital. Oh. She ended up being in the hospital for 3 weeks after that. And I was like, well, if I hadn't, said we needed to take her temperature, she might not have, oh my God. It was a horrible time, of course. And my mom did not, she survived. There was a really scary, that 3 weeks after I took her temperature and it was 106, there was a really scary period that my dad has actually written about extensively, like sort of the day to day managing of the crisis where she almost died like multiple times. And they really thought it's time to bring the kids in to say goodbye. She survived and she was like, well, I'm never going through that again. That was horrendous. And she went into remission and then we were out of remission and the cancer was back, but she was feeling relatively okay. And the doctors were like, well, here are your options. And she was like, well, those options all sound like kind of what I went through 2 years ago that almost killed me and pretty much wrecked my family's life in the process. What else can what are my other choices? Give me something else. And they were like, well, if you want to go explore other things, this is a time for you to explore other things, essentially. If you want to try acupuncture, I think that was sort of what they had in mind. Like, go try some acupuncture, see if that makes you feel better. So what she did was she went to this Chinese healing center in Jamaica Plain, which is in the Boston area. And she was there, I think, for 2 full weeks. And when she came back, my brother and I were pretty little kids, and we both remember this. It was like everything was different. She had this new diet that had to be followed very exactly. And I recognized it when I listened to the podcast that you recommended. You were just talking about the Still Processing podcast, and they talk about Gwyneth Paltrow and her macrobiotic diet, which she was on for quite some time. This was the diet that my mom had been told would make her well again. That it was all about the food that she put in her body. And it was all about, she drank this tea that I still remember the smell of. It was so strong and it filled the entire house. And it was like really sweet smelling, but also made me feel kind of sick. And this became our entire lives. It really did, because she always had a different meal from us. and she became really obsessed with what more can I do? How many things can I do that might add up to me being well?
And if I have to do them exactly right, then I will live. God, the pressure that I feel like that explains a lot about you becoming, the overachieving perfectionist that you are. No, seriously, when it's like, okay, but you have to, it's like when I was told the skin brushing does a lot, but you have to get it exactly right. And then they just put the fear of God into you.
That's what I thought of. Exactly. Yes.
Skin brushing. So I can only imagine with the T's in the diet, cannot deviate. Don't step off the tightrope.
Yeah, it was a tightrope. It was absolutely a tightrope. And actually my brother wrote a book for his class. He was in first grade, I think, when we were in this round of cancer. So he, first grade in our public school that we went to was like the year that everyone writes a gajillion books and publishes them. And he wrote this book all about when Mom went to the healing center. And then the last chapter of the book is called Diet, Big Diet. And so there's the version that he wrote out by hand, and there's the version that my dad transcribed, typing so that it was actually legible. But that was what he wanted to call the chapter. And so I just revisited this recently. Like I went through my dad's basement and came out with a whole bunch of stuff that my brother and I wrote when we were kids. The diet loomed so large in all of our lives. It just became such a thing. And we never ate the same way again after that. Whereas a year before this diet, we went to live in Europe for a year. I've told stories about that too. And everything was all about like, where do we go to eat the best things? Let's go eat the best things. Let's eat the best cheese. Let's eat the best bread. Everything is like this is what living is all about. And it was like a major, major shift back in a very different direction that I think both my brother and I were a little bit thrown by, but kind of trying to like, okay, all right, now we're doing the diet. All right, let's try and keep up here. And my dad, I think, was really trying to like make sure that our lives stayed somewhat stable and that we didn't, we weren't too subject to the kind of swings of this lifestyle. But it was definitely, that is a point that I remember where like everything changed. And the hope was always just like, well, maybe this will work. Like maybe this will work and maybe we won't have to go through chemo again. And we did. We were back. She was back in chemotherapy after about 2 years. And part of that was because she had lost so much weight that it was really, really concerning. And finally, her oncologist felt like he had to step in and say, I'm sorry, but this isn't working anymore. And I need to really insist that you come back to the hospital. Anyway, so that went on longer than I intended to, but I was really surprised at how moved I was in reading about Gwyneth Paltrow's journey to becoming who she is and who we think of her as now, because I identify so strongly with her desire to save her father's life. Maybe if I introduce this diet and maybe if we all do it right, he'll be okay, and then I'll be okay. God, that makes a lot of sense to me,
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we talk about diet and we talk about our bodies, it's no wonder that all of this can be distilled into thinner bodies or healthy bodies. And people who eat this are healthy and people who eat this are not. When we categorize foods as good foods or bad foods or what you get, I know that I don't like talking about food with people because I know how much confusion exists and abounds, and I don't feel comfortable guiding people on their food journey because mine is so drastically different. My autoimmune disease is now a fad diet. And if you were to go eat pizza, regular pizza, and we were to put my gluten-free pizza right next to it, mine is way less by any metric of health. Mine is going to have more sugar. Mine's going to have more fat. Mine's going to have infinitely more salt. It's going to have all the things that you're not supposed to have. So how this has been presented as healthier because gluten offsets all the others, it's just preposterous to me. Gluten-free donut, same thing. It's still a donut. Yeah. I mean, if you consider this is just a donut that will not poison me specifically when I eat it. So when when as a society, we just don't know how to talk about bodies or how to talk about foods.
Yeah. And you never know what you might say that will never get out of the other person's head. That to you did not have the meaning that you thought it did, but to them might be like, oh, this is what MK thinks about this food. Or this is what Sarah thinks about the way I eat. And that's just like, because I've been that person. I've been that person that heard the thing that never went away ever again.
Oh, I've spoken, I think, at least in the past, maybe not here, maybe it's time to do it again, but my discomfort eating with people, in general, because I went from the fat kid to the not fat adult in a household where it was like just role reversal. And then watching all of my friends sort of struggle in a way that I didn't have to made meal times really impossible. Thin shaming is a thing. And yes, thin privilege absolutely exists, but that does not in any way make thin shaming okay. Like when I'm sitting at a dinner and I order food and everyone at the course becomes pouncing on me, you don't eat enough to keep a bird alive. Not true. Oh my gosh, you're eating way too much. I bet you, if follow her to the bathroom, I know she's going to vomit. Like that's not nice. And for years I wouldn't. Like I've only just kind of started maybe doing it a little bit again, because the only thing worse than the thin shaming is people sort of expecting me to guide them. Like, well, what should I order? I'm you have, like, I eat the magic skinny food. Right. And I'm like, I don't know that I'm what you need to be emulating. I do what I have to do because I'm guided by celiac disease and I have very serious limitations that I do not think anyone should have to embrace. Why would you?
Why would you? Right.
So it's not like there's some answer that's eluding you, but because none of us really know how to have this conversation, I don't know what to do. I'm going to follow you. I just tend to opt out of it because it never leads anywhere positive or winning for me. Like just yesterday, I had lunch with some women for the first time, and someone made the offhand comment, like, you're always eating the healthy stuff. And the way, and a part of me no one really wants to hear the why. Like, well, let me tell you, when I was diagnosed with celiac a long time ago, they had to reprogram my brain. That is what I did. Insurance paid for me to work with a nutritionist for 18 months because to make it instinctual when I'm in a space, how do I feed myself in a way that nourishes me so that I'm not hungry later and that doesn't make me sick? And when you're used to eating pizzas or ramen noodles or noodles of any kind and sandwiches, think about what you pack for your kids or what you would pack for yourself if you were packing a picnic lunch. I can't have any of those things. Anything that can be preserved or held in your fridge for more than a couple of days, I cannot consume it. And the stuff in my freezer has so much salt that I can only afford to have it maybe once every 3 or 4 days because frozen foods tend to be, like frozen prepared gluten-free meals are so salty that they make my fingers swell. So I have to think twice before having one. So I got to be prepared all the time in a way most humans don't. So why would you choose this? So whenever I talk, I don't like to think about diets or restricting, like cutting out gluten is not what you need to do. You work with someone to reprogram what you think or what a meal is when it's time to do that. Like if you want to embrace a new lifestyle, this is why I say don't do it by restricting or doing clicking on those clickbaity articles, the top 4 foods that cause inflammation. Work with a nutritionist who's going to help you form those brand new habits and a new relationship with food. Lunch used to be, for me, a sandwich and an apple, and was for decades. And now, I mean, ask my mom. I ate the same thing for lunch every damn day from kindergarten until I graduated from high school. I'm that much a creature of routine, and the same thing for breakfast every single day since my diagnosis in 2006 up until now. It never deviates because it's safe and it's there, and I don't mind it. Food is utility for me. I've never really gotten to have the luxury of being a foodie and being like, what tastes amazing? Because so little of what tastes amazing, like a good bechamel sauce, I can't eat it. And I can't put it on the things that it tastes really good with, like those handmade, from scratch noodles in the coolest, newest farm to table restaurant. I can't do it. So all that just to say that the reprogramming of my brain was critical so that I could eat safely. And that is where my food choices are based. My way is not categorically de facto better if you don't have celiac.
Yeah. Yeah. And but people do, like, there's so much projection that happens when you watch the way another person eats, and you immediately sort of, I don't mean to say everybody, but a lot of people, because without applying critical thinking, a lot of people are just kind of see your food choices and decide that it's an in to like talking about the way you eat, judging their own selves. People actually around Thanksgiving, I think this was on Dumb Runner, the bingo card, the Thanksgiving table bingo card is like, are you going to eat that whole thing? Like, you'll have to run this off. Did you already run so you could run this? Like all of the stupid things people say when they're around a table with a lot of indulgent food, and they have this really guilty relationship with it, and they feel the need to kind of discharge it onto you, and they see either, someone seeming very comfortable with what they're eating, or someone, maybe choosing not to eat this one thing that they've decided is the really healthy or really unhealthy thing. Let's make a comment about that. And I mean, that bingo card, man, at my family Thanksgiving, I would have made out like a bandit. I have a lot of runners in my family. We all run a race on Thanksgiving Day. There's a lot of quipping about how many miles you would have to run for this piece of pie or that piece of pie. And I don't mean to judge people for having sort of goofy conversations, because we all do it. But the thing about food at a family gathering without the critical thinking applied to things like this is just the way you can trigger so many things that people are struggling with that you might not know.
Because also in that moment, if you were to bust into it, I call myself like #feminist buzzkill. Like when I hear the exactly. Depending on where I am, I might be like, that thing you just said is incredibly unhealthy and promotes eating disorders. Please don't say that in front of my child. Not everyone has the type of social clout or the sort of clout even in their family to be able to do that. So I want you to hear me when I say, if you're the person who says that, awesome. Mm-hmm. It's shaming to live in the should. So if you are not the person who says those things, there's nothing saying you shouldn't, that you should be, right? Or that you're doing this incorrectly. It is not your job to bust up, to sacrifice. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep everyone else warm. But if you do hear disturbing things, maybe jumping in the middle of it isn't going to promote the conversation. But if you see how these comments hurt your child, maybe then it's time to have a conversation with that child about what they heard and why you didn't feel safe, and a good conversation with yourself to say, this is why I know what they said to you was really cruel. I didn't like it, and this is why I didn't speak up there, because here's what the consequences will be. Yeah. But I'm going to do it anyway. Yeah. And I want you to understand, it's not you in that moment. It was, I can't preserve you if I'm not preserving me too. There are layers to it that we don't talk about, that that children are quick to be like, well, this isn't a problem because the person who's supposed to protect me did not validate me in that moment. Right. So don't take necessarily the weight of the world on you. But if there's a reason that you have not been speaking up yet, that you have not felt safe or comfortable to, that's something worth exploring, not necessarily something that needs to change. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
I can't tell you what to feel or how to deal, because you know the consequences better than I ever will. Where I have evolved to is I did everything right and I still got raped. I did everything right and he still did not go to jail. I did everything differently and everything right, and it happened again. And no one listened the second time either. So I just started doing everything wrong. I'm like, well, if you ain't going to listen either way, then I'm just going to do the wrong thing and see what happens. And I went pretty hard down that rabbit hole, and then had to save myself. Like in my late 20s, I just got tired of being angry and started turning things around. So that's if there's a part that seems like deep down I don't give a fuck, that's true. Yeah. But that's a consequence very much of where I've been as well. And that's of my journey. If you're not there yet, again, it's not better or the way you should be. I don't think anybody should have to experience trauma.
Well, and also nobody should have to play by the rules of a game that is rigged against them. And I mean, that's basically what you're saying. You played the game correctly. You played by the rules. It was still rigged against you, and you weren't going to be able to change that by doing it righter.
Yes. My silence did not protect me. So I'm just going to be loud. I'm going to make you hear it until, and so, so anyway, that's like my particular, not to go too far off the range, but, there are things that we don't say, and there are very valid reasons why we don't say them a lot of the time. Yeah. But when you look at the categories that exist in the wellness industry, when you look at the way we talk about diets and food and how intertwined it all is with our bodies and whether or not they're healthy, all these categories in wellness all have to do with the body. There's a link in the show notes that will show you the emerging categories in this huge multi-billion-dollar global industry. And the one at the top is anti-aging. And then everything beneath it has to do with different types of nutrition/diets. Whether or not you need wellness depends greatly on how you feel about your body and how you feel in your body. And this can become a marketing trap and it's hard to separate between, I don't feel good because X, or I will feel better if I do Y. There might not be a correlation actually between X action and Y result and feeling better. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing we don't talk about. Yeah. Sometimes restricting food gives us a sense of control, and that can derive a sense of satisfaction too, but it's a false sense of control. And if you read any literature on eating disorders anywhere on the spectrum, it's all fundamentally a control issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. And this is a conversation that we're starting now, but that we are never going to finish having. We are going to keep having it all the time, because when you stop talking about it and you stop kind of, again, applying critical thinking to all of these messages that you're receiving, that is when it becomes easier to succumb to them and start thinking things about yourself that aren't helping you. And that's so we just really want to emphasize, I think, that, we're not, this is like parenting. This is something that someone told me about parenting that I remember a lot, is that everything that you dole out as a parent is a download. It's a download that isn't necessarily going to be, launched immediately, but you're having conversations. You don't have one conversation about sex with your kids. You have conversations about sex with your kids regularly, one hopes, starting, age appropriate, with the right amount, the right amount of information delivered in an age appropriate way. And you never stop doing that. And in my family, in my house, the conversation about our bodies and the way we feel about our bodies and the way we let other people interact with our bodies, those are conversations that are going to be had continuously for the entire time that my daughter is living in my house. And I hope, if I do it right, if I do it at least part of it right, that she'll feel like she can come talk to me about it when she's in her 30s and she's feeling fucked up about something that she saw on whatever version of Instagram is going to be around in 30 years that's making her feel shitty, and she wants to unpack that. I want to unpack that with her. I want to be there, and we want to be there with you always with this conversation.
The point where, the point you just made, there was a psychologist, a child development specialist last year, the year before, that made a comment that was then taken and twisted and reprinted everywhere without context. And this is one of the reasons why I have opted out of most traditional media, or when I say mainstream media in my accent, like, I don't know, I just don't trust the mainstream media. People like put two and two together and kind of go down a rabbit hole. Oh, you're this type of person, instead of being like, actually, the media has failed us in ways large and small. This child development specialist, if you were to hear the entire interview that she did, she talked about it starts with being responsible for your own role in consent and teaching consent to your child. Because long before, creepy Uncle Frank came in and said, sit on my lap and give me a kiss, you have been laying them on a table and taking their pants off without thinking about how that could violate their space. At what point do we transition from this to do this yourself to you're independent here to, yes, I can decide not to sit on the lap of a dude who last time I did, I think had a heart on it and it made me feel really uncomfortable. Or when he tickles me, he puts his hand under my shirt. This person wants me to do this. It's my job to say yes, acquiesce, and get out of the way really quickly and not make him uncomfortable. Like, we're teaching children really from a young age that is implicit. And when we say just kiss him and go away, like, we're go along to get along is the message. So yeah, you don't need permission from your baby to change a diaper with poop in it, but maybe it's worth thinking about in that moment. This is a vulnerable moment I'm responsible for, and this is where it kind of starts. So maybe it's worth getting into the habit of acknowledging what I'm doing right now is I'm taking this off and I'm exposing my child's cooch to whoever's in the room. It doesn't necessarily end there. And it's not, if you don't do this, then your child will be, but it's being cognizant of your own role in your child's understanding of consent. Mm-hmm. But that requires talking about body parts. And I don't want to talk about sex with my 3-year-old. And no one says you have to, but body autonomy, there's a way to discuss it that none of us are taught that has now become part of the zeitgeist. And I'm really appreciating it. But when you reduce it to psychologist says you must ask for consent before changing the diaper of a 3-month-old, no one's going to listen to that shit. And a really good message is going to be lost. So I hope nothing what we're saying here becomes that sort of clickbait that would turn your brain off. But I know when I hear wellness, there's a part of my brain that turns off because I'm going to assume it's something that is not scientifically backed. It is luxurious, and I can't afford it. Mm-hmm. And that is being sold to or marketed as the answer to people who have exhausted their ability to find answers in the traditional space. So I will always be open to wellness stuff. I still get acupuncture. I had it yesterday. And it's, I don't know if that's what made the difference last year, but hell, if I'm going to stop since I'm feeling better. But at the same time, like I'm not going my acupuncturist has never posited himself as the answer. That he even said the last time I went in and was having a pain somewhere, he's like, you need to see your doctor about that. Here's what we're going to do, but you need to see your doctor about that. And lo and behold, there's a mass in my pelvis that the doctor found and I pushed for, and I'm going to have it surgically removed in a couple weeks. So it doesn't always have to lead to bad things, but if the second he says, I can fix everything myself, that I no longer trust that person. When they say, macrobiotic diet and a wheatgrass shot in the morning will shrink the tumors in your mother's breasts, I'd be like, fuck you. There will always, when it gets to superlatives, as opposed to if you have the money and the time and it helps, why not? Why wouldn't you? Yeah. That's a very different value proposition.
Yeah. And I think that ultimately, so I mean, the sort of wellness journey, for lack of a less hokey term for it, that my mom went on over the years really culminated in some things that I think absolutely helped her. And one of those things was writing. The things that she's written, and some of them I've shared through the Morning Mantra podcast or my blog. She wrote a lot, especially in the last 2 years of her life. And that she went to a writing class, several writing classes, actually. After she did one, she decided she liked it and she went back and she did some painting. I actually have a couple of paintings of hers hanging up in my house, and so does my brother. Those are things that she did in the pursuit of being well. And one of the things that I really liked that they started out with on the Still Processing podcast about the Gooped article is that aspiring to be well is a good thing. Aspiring to be well is something that we should all, think about and ponder. That's different from aspiring to wellness TM, the trademarked, the product of wellness that is marketed to us in all these different ways. But there, in no way do we want to say that aspiring to wellness as an idea, as a state of being for your body and your mind, that is very much, I mean, that's why we have a business. That's why we do what we do. Running is a part of what we do to be well. But the distinction is important, and yet the word itself, to go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, the word has become tied up in so many things that I think it is important to disentangle it from.
Well, think about the first time you encountered me and my philosophy somewhere. It was probably on that original podcast, number 206 with AMR a long time ago. When I say run, what do you hear and what you think of is probably very different than the motion, the activity that I'm actually referring to. I'm usually referring to jogging. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When most people think of running, they think of it has to be fast, it has to be all out. They're thinking like they're on a treadmill. Push the jog button, which gets you to 4.0 miles per hour, or you hit the run button, which is 7.0 miles per hour. And that was something that was made up just to facilitate a button being there and having to like tap to increase the speed. It wasn't there because that's based off of some definition of what is and what is not. And jogging is, well, I guess before I go to, too much further, there are lots of different ways to be healthy that we're going to discuss and explore. But what the purposes of this podcast, we wanted to lay the foundation of that intersection between wellness and body image. So one thing that I do to stay well, because I am terrified of the consequences otherwise. I've talked openly about how I'm a traumatized child in a grown-up's body, from where my father had a heart attack, a widowmaker at the age of 33, and that was 1983, and he had a quintuple bypass, survived. 15 years later, had a full heart transplant, and it's now 12 years beyond that. So from an overnight, our household changed. He was a 3-pack-a-day smoker. He worked in Nashville for the family business and then was driving 80 minutes in the opposite direction to go to law school at night. My mother never saw him. He weighed over 300 pounds. How much I don't know exactly, but he's only ever said, everyone called him Big Daddy. That was his nickname. And I remember his reaction the first time someone told me, this is what we used to call your dad, see what happens when you do, and I almost got smacked across the room. Because to him, Big Daddy had a heart attack, and then Richard Brooks came out the other side. And it was never said to him kindly. And he looks back on all the behavior that was encouraged as cool in his fraternity was all the stuff that led to a heart attack. And he kind of wishes he had stopped sooner, but they were all also the drinking, the smoking. It was all coping mechanisms to deal with this super incredibly stressful lifestyle at the time. So the drinking obviously left, the smoking left. I don't ever even remember having ashtrays in our house. I was so little. Our diet changed overnight because he had to lose a whole lot of weight before they could even perform the first surgery. They said he was so large he wouldn't survive. And like no sugar, like you couldn't find any salt anywhere in our house. You couldn't, there was no bacon. There was all the fun was kind of sucked out, and we all kind of lived in fear of and doctors impress us as well. You have a family history of this. His heart beats in your body, and it could go in any minute if you don't do these things. So the path to wellness was not monitoring what I ate, but to the point where, like, I still bristle because we're always told that we totally lack self-awareness. So there's a bit of truth in everything thrown your way. So I think my relationship with food, for the most part, was not the problem. The problems that I had when I was younger went much deeper. But it wasn't about, I need to eat less. It was just sort of like, if you have to eat this way or you will gain, and you have to run, because if you become sedentary, drink and smoke too much and gain all this weight, then you're going to have a heart attack too. So I'm like, well, all I have to do is not do the dumb stuff, stay and play in this space. And then everything, you didn't say anything about drugs. So this is where all the went haywire in my 20s, where I was like, well, I'm just going to do all the wrong things. I still do my run every day, heart beats strong in this chest. That's how I justified a lot of it. But all that just to say, there can be a healthier, or a way that is not overly unhealthy of doing things. So rather than trying to find that tightrope, if this is the right way, stay on the tightrope, fall off the tightrope, and one step off the tightrope and you will die. The way of I look at my whole life, as evidenced by a test called the EAT that no one, no matter how long they train with me, seems to understand. And I think I've got a new visual presentation of that I'm going to be rolling out in the next few months. That will make a lot more sense. But instead of having, here's what you do, here's the line you don't cross, and everything on this side of the line is fair game and you're probably going to be okay. Once I started looking at life that way, everything got way easier. And the path forward, the options, the choices were much, 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 much easier to make. Yeah. So, but that's where body image comes into play. So, broad, high level definition of the word. You ready for this one, Sarah? You mentioned how triggering this is for you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I am ready. I thought that.
Okay. I was like, whoa, that's a long pause. Okay.
Okay. I'm ready. Okay. All right. But do it quick.
So you got the right answers and the true answers. These are conflicting messages that most of us receive throughout our lives. You are not broken. You're a product of your environment. That environment has been an incredibly contradictory one when it comes to body image. It's shaming to live in the should, and we know that you should love your body, but we don't know what to tell you when you don't, or who can love their body and when. Or is it okay to love a fat body? Is it okay to love an unhealthy body? What kind of bodies are we allowed to love? And this is the interesting about the conversation we find ourselves in now, where a certain bend of body positivity has become quite toxic, where there was a book written a while ago called Body Positive by a British, I want to say a page 3 model, because everyone referred to her in such derivative terms, where she posed naked effectively. And rather than being like, hey, we're the nation that puts naked people on the front of our paper to sell papers, we just make fun of the women that get paid to be there. But I digress. So she wrote a book about called Body Positive, and how she learned to start loving her body. And part of her journey was having some plastic surgery. Immediately, the backlash started, where if you change some part of your body, then how can you possibly love it? Like, the point of this should be how you learn to love your body without having to surgically alter it. What sort of a message are you sending to people who could never afford plastic surgery, or to people, are you telling them all to do it? What's your roadmap here? And she was very clear in her response, but no one really wanted to hear it. So who is allowed to love their bodies? It's a very interesting question. But body image at the highest level is just how a person perceives their own body and their relationship to that perception. I perceive myself as fat and I hate it. I perceive myself as thin and I hate it. I perceive myself as fat and I love it. I perceive myself as thin and I love it as long as I'm thin. So there are always like commas and codas and question marks. And what do we really say? And who is allowed to be? In 1983, before my dad's heart attack, would the notion that anyone would have said to him, I mean, he gets angry. Like, am I supposed to be positive? I am positive that was not a healthy body. How about that? I'm positive that body was a year away from a permanent change that would disrupt our family forever. I don't know where the line is between a healthy body and an unhealthy body, but it kind of starts with our perception of our own body and our relationship to that perception, and then how we project that onto other people. How dare you love that fat body when I hate my thin body or my less fat body as much as I do? There's a sense of righteous indignation about it.
Yeah, that's like what the part of Shrill, which we'll include a link to that in the show notes. Shrill by Lindy West, the part where she talks about meeting the man who trolled her. And
yes.
And when he told her that the way she was defiant and out there and clearly, loved who she was, that made him angry, because he was a fat kid growing up and he hated his body and he hated himself, and he hated that she could live in her body, a fat body, and feel good about it and have things to say and have a voice. And he really did. I mean, she has and had a lot of vile trolls who are, harassing her all the time. But he went so far as to do enough research on her to make a profile that was supposed to be her late father, a profile for himself on Twitter, from where he posed as her father and said, I'm the father to 2 kids. One turned out okay. The other one is, I'm ashamed of, or whatever, referring to her, found a picture of her dad for the Twitter avatar and came at her and started harassing her. And this was, you may have heard about this on a This American Life episode, which re-aired recently, actually. They ended up talking to each other. He ended up coming to her and saying that after she wrote about the experience of being trolled in this way and how traumatizing it was to be trolled by somebody who was literally assuming her father's identity and harassing her from that point of view. It was so personal and so hurtful. And he came to her and said, it was me, and this is why I did it. I did it because I hated myself so much, and watching you love yourself and be a fat person was immensely triggering to me. And he actually agreed to be interviewed for This American Life, and they talked about it. And it's, oh my God. I mean, I haven't listened to the re-air that came out a few weeks ago, because the first time I heard it, it destroyed me hearing this conversation. It's so emotional. And there's a slightly different version of it that's portrayed in the TV show Shrill that Hulu made with Adie Bryant, which I've written about on my blog because I love it and it's so good. But it's just really, it goes so deep, the way that people can take their own self-hatred and then turn it around onto someone else who they see living in a body that they can't imagine being happy with.
Or a body that they've never been allowed to enjoy.
Correct. Yeah. Or let alone love.
Yeah, because his story was pretty tragic.
Yes.
Which does not excuse what he did.
No.
But why he hated his body so much is it's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And I think she was genuinely very moved by the fact that, and the thing for me is that the fact that he agreed to be interviewed, the fact that he agreed to have a taped interview with her on a podcast that millions and millions of people listen to. I can't forgive doing what he did to her, but I respect what he did to try and be better, and make amends, And,
well, that's the thing. Sorry.
No. And bring light to this immensely destructive inner conflict that so many people are in with themselves. I think that is that brings a lot of value.
But what you said is kind of important too, because this is the crux, right? You just said you can't forgive him, even though he gave the apology, did it publicly, and is doing right now. If we can't forgive that, it doesn't excuse the behavior, but forgiveness is the ability to move past it. If this came up in a Google search, would you still hire this person? I would. I won't hire the person that has doubled down, walked away, been like, everyone's too sensitive, instead of kind of saying, you know what? I don't agree with all of it because it's me, but I've been doing some work and I can see where they came from. There's a big difference. And we're in a period now where apology without ownership and without change doesn't do any good. But when an apology comes with true contrition and true change, if we don't give it to a person and kind of go on, again, you can give forgiveness without excusing actions.
Yeah. That's true.
When does the self-flagellation end? How long what else does this guy have to do to be allowed back into society? And at what point are we no better than the townsfolk in the Scarlet Letter?
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, you're right. I think that's a distinction that makes sense to me. I think what I meant to say is, I would, as much as I respect what he has done, I would never want to erase the hurt that this kind of thing causes. You know what I mean? That trolling people on the internet causes. Yeah, but I completely agree with you that a public apology and making amends and really kind of putting your money where your mouth is, that is hard to do. Yeah. Taking responsibility, actual taking responsibility is hard to do. And that is what a lot of men who have been accused of doing terrible things have not done. But we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. Because that's probably a whole nother podcast.
Well, Pastor Nadia Bowles-Weber, she's incredible. She has a series on PBS Makers where she describes, and we'll have the link to this in the show notes too, and to this This American Life podcast. So Nadia Bowles-Weber describes forgiveness as a gigantic set of bolt cutters that, like, it's not about you are now the anger or the hurt that arises from the action tethers you to another person, and forgiveness is like bolt cutters that set you free. It's not about absolution, and it's not about moving forward together. It's about severing the tie that binds you, which is making peace with the hurt. And if we can't make peace with we can't get to a point where we are discerning and defining what a correct apology is and the change behavior, then no one is ever going to apologize. They're going to continue to double down and say, well, did you see that guy? I mean, God, what do I have to do? Just because I can't get on This American Life and absolve myself, that means I can't move forward. That's not fair. So when we have to be really careful about how we talk about these things, especially in a podcast that starts with Ana Vernulas, baby got back. So like defining what is an apology, what does that entail? What does that look like? How about forgiveness? Nothing ever excuses bad behavior and nothing ever makes it okay. But exploring where it came from can make it a little bit easier to bring out the bolt cutters and move on. Yeah. So, and speaking of that, I guess we need to move on just a little bit, because how long have we been talking now, Sarah?
We've been talking for about 1 hour now. And
wow.
Survey says that people like podcasts that are about an hour to maximum of 90 minutes. But we promised that we would rein ourselves in and, not make people run for a half an hour more than they were planning to in order to finish listening to us.
No, for sure. When it comes to body image and wellness, the biggest part of the intersection here at Fitness Protection is we're trying to encourage healthy habits. We do not, I have watched in many different ways how the current culture of running has evolved over the past 20 years from the cardio rehab and the, jogging for health that happened in the 1970s to where we are right now, which is drastically, radically, incredibly different. And how where we are today, I think, is quite dangerous, very unhealthy. And I see part of what my role, our role, Fitness Protection's role moving forward is to make jogging sexy again, to remind you that less is more, to show you that I don't care how much anyone weighs. I don't need to know what is or has ever been in your belly or between your legs to get you where you want to go next. It's not part of what I do. And it shouldn't have to be part of what I do, because all bodies can be potentially happy, healthy bodies. And there is no body that is incapable or unworthy of love. In this series, we're going to talk a little bit more about where that line of wellness is drawn, both by the medical community and health, actually, between health and wellness and prevention and, just cult-like thinking. We're going to talk about all those lines and where they exist. We're going to talk with medical professionals. We're going to talk with thought leaders. It would be amazing if any of you have a direct connection to Ijeoma Luo or Lindy West. Bring them on, because we are too small to get their agents' attention. But we're going to talk to as many people as we can start. Not yet. Yeah, we're hoping we can start a conversation that's going to last for a very long time. It will be inclusive to men, to women, and especially to the differently abled or people that are living with a disability, people living with chronic pain. Because I found it really hard to love a body that wasn't functioning amidst chronic pain for a really long time, and was forced to kind of examine my relationship to my body and to my fears of how my health would be declining during my year in bed. That all kind of ties back to body image. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I'm hoping that we can, at least over time, come up with some sort of a framework for critical thinking that will lead to healthier results and that will not categorically be fear-based, while giving you permission and a validation. You think what you think for a very good reason. All of you are smart, functioning, incredible humans. What we don't usually take the time to do is take a look at the toxic stew that we live in, all of the whys that have impacted our actions and our instincts. We take it on ourselves and say, well, I know I shouldn't love my body, without looking at all of the forces that told us not to and refused to allow us. We are going to, in the series, we're going to look at these forces. We are going to look at each other. We're going to look deep inside, and we're going to give you permission to say, hey, you know what? 40 years of conditioning does not fall away overnight. Learning to look at myself differently, learning to evaluate myself differently is a process. And I am so excited to start this process with all of you, because God, I love you so fucking much. It's unbelievable.
And I love all of you so much too. I really do. And I love this community because I feel like there is openness to hearing and to thinking about these things. There is a desire to examine the things that make us feel bad about ourselves, and to really work on changing 40 years of conditioning, and to really work on moving the needle on how we look at ourselves and how we think about ourselves and how we talk about ourselves. And I just want to be really clear, this does not mean that there is no room in our community for someone who wants to lose weight, because there absolutely is. And I thought that I read a regular feature on slate.com called Care and Feeding, and it's a parenting blog, and I think it's just beautifully written, and there are different people who write it every day. And someone wrote in asking about, how do I talk to my niece about the fact that I just lost a whole bunch of weight, and it's a different lifestyle for me. I'm more vigilant about what I eat, but I don't want to tell her through my actions that she should want to lose weight. I don't want to tell her through my actions that my body wasn't acceptable before. And what the columnist, whose name is Jamila Lemieux, and I think she's brilliant, and I love her as well. What she wrote back is this: the movement against fat shaming doesn't require you to be fat to end the stigma against big-bodied people, but rather for you to be vigilant about calling out the bias they endure. You deserve to feel good in your skin. You can continue to work towards that as you see fit and be a voice of love and support for fat folks without apology. I think that really gets to the fact that you want what you want for your body. And we are not going to tell you that what you want is wrong. And we're not going to tell you that you want the wrong thing, or that you should, that you should love your body in a specific way that anyone is prescribing. That's not what we're about.
You can still love your body it's possible to love your body and want to make some changes. Both can be true simultaneously. It's not about like, well, if you loved your body, you wouldn't want to change it. Like this sort of ugly place we are in call out culture where we try to spot the hypocrisy in certain individuals that seem to be happy and confident, but not in the individuals that are confident in their hypocrisy and just talking out both sides of their mouth all the time.
Yeah. And,
and there are a lot of fitness professionals who do that.
There are a lot, and the running world. I think that the amateur running world, the recreational running world, can be quietly devastating if you're not able to step back from it and examine the way these things work and see the way that thoughtless comments, thoughtless headlines in blogs you read online, they can get into your head, and it can be really, really hard to identify where they're coming from, because it kind of seems like it's coming from everywhere sometimes.
Oh, yeah. And how banning speech doesn't necessarily lead to better results. Like, we weren't allowed to say the word fat in our household. We were never allowed to refer to my father's fatness to my fatness. It was all heavily, heavily, heavily implied. I wish they had just said it because it got so ugly. And this is where kids, yes, they're beautiful and pure, but we teach them to read between the lines, and we kind of force them to. It's one of the reasons I'm so direct in all directions. Like, the worst you can do is say that was really direct and that was really mean. I'm like, but it's kind. I think it's kind to know where you stand, as opposed to, are you really going to eat that? Are you sure this is a good, healthy choice? Let's make better choices. That's very.
How many miles are you going to have to run to burn that off?
I'm getting concerned, but yeah, I could spend a whole day talking about that movie Dumpling. I did not have the same reaction to it everyone else did. I was like, you don't know what that woman has been through, because I looked at Jennifer Aniston and I saw my mother, and I saw a woman who is incredibly beautiful, who, as she started, people just couldn't wait for her to put on a little weight and for her to lose that beauty. They just could not wait. And the expectations that we have of thin privilege absolutely exists, but that doesn't mean that presence of privilege means that all problems are gone. And when we don't give grace in two directions, we're really not telling the whole story. But that's going to go too far off the reservation. I think we're out of that for today. But the way you react to every single character in a movie like Dumpling or a book like Shrill tells you a lot about yourself and your own story and your own journey, the things you've been allowed to feel, and the conditioning from which you have emerged. And now that most of us, hopefully everyone listening to this podcast is 18 or over, you are master of your own life and master of your own domain. We can start working on our own, or with the therapist, or at least with each other, to start thinking about creating a positive, healthy environment for ourselves and for our children. And that is more likely to happen if we're talking about fat than if we're banning the word. Lots of words, as a matter of fact.
I think that is the perfect note to end on. I think you absolutely nailed it. Because we are going to talk about it. I love you. I think I fucking love you more.
Not possible.
That's what you think. More soon, everybody. You know it.
You are coached. You are loved. Let's go win at the 3rd week of June. Woo!